I chose to move the radiator location for these hydraulic hoses on my John Deere 318. Along with an engine swap, I'm going to rebuild this tractor to use for plowing snow and blowing snow with a snowblower. So this video is a quick walkthrough of how I went through the schematic to see how the cooling system works for the hydraulic fluid, and then also how I chose to mount the new radiator. We took the radiators out, and when you pull them out, you can see this is a pretty simple design. If you look at the schematic, here is the cooler itself. So there's two coolers in series, and they're basically inside that dashed line. And you can see they end up here on the return line, and that right there means that the return is above the level of the fluid, which means there's no pressure in this line because it's basically at the pressure of the atmosphere inside the reservoir. So the cooler comes up here, and you can see there's a T, and one section comes from the steering out, and the other line comes from the out of the control valves. So sure enough, here's the T, there is the line from the steering, and the opposite end goes back down on the bottom of the selective control valve. So the water comes back after being used in the steering first, and then in your remotes. It comes through the cooler and then returns down this line that goes back to the pump. And there it is in the schematic. From the steering, from the control valves, through the cooler, and back to the reservoir of the pump. So now, if we get an aftermarket radiator, we basically come into the radiator with this and go out of the radiator with that. And to keep things simple, we're going to replace these 3/8 lines with new ones, and I'll probably bring the new one up, put the T here in the factory location, and then have the 3/8 line loop down and come back. And then this one, I'll attach the 3/8 line and go back as well, so we'll keep everything as normal as possible. And then both lines will return out back here. Both the 3/8 lines will be against this side of the frame, and I'll be able to mount the radiator right here. So it comes into the radiator, out of the radiator, and then back to the reservoir. I think that's going to work out well. It'll also give me a reason to replace all the old 3/8 lines. I'm probably also going to replace this high pressure line too, because it was rubbing against this finning, so it's not great shape. But this is the return line right here actually. If you upside down here, that return right here, after it goes through the devices, goes into that line, comes up in a hard line, and returns back in here. And this proves why you need to push these down when you push this in manual, because it opens up these relief valves. And if you look at the schematic in the John Deere book, you can see the manual relief valves are right here. So that little T semaphore on top of the valve means it's a manual valve, whereas these have a spring with a ball detent. Well, not a ball detent, but a spring ball to keep the pressure. And then here's another return into the reservoir. So that's all over the place here. One other neat thing is if you go through this manual and look at the schematic symbol designations, you can actually walk yourself through this, and it makes it pretty straightforward. For example, here's the control valves, and the difference between these two control valves is this one has the float position. And it makes sense because it's drawn that if you operate this, that little catch is going to hit on that mark there, that detent. So all the information is right there in the manual, and really just going over it for 5 or 10 minutes will make it seem pretty straightforward. So that's the plan. My John Deere 318 is coming along. I put the radiator in, like I mentioned, and I think it's going to work out really well. I did a quick paint job on that rear end to keep it from oxidizing and rusting when it gets snow on it. But this radiator is a Deere 15230, and it's got 2 circuits. One circuit I'll use for the hydro, and that circuit I'll use for the oil. And it does have a fan on it, and so when the gas tank sits on top here, the air will come up through the radiator and come out the back. I might make a baffle here in the front and on the sides to direct the air towards the back, but I think that's going to work out. The frame is not straight. You could see how it is not square with the front of the tractor, and it's because these frame rails, the 90 isn't as sharp as this side. It's almost like either the frame was tweaked, or when they built it after the stamping process, this wasn't all the way flat, so I had to cheat this mount because the mount is actually square. It's just that the frame itself is bent, so I tried to bend it a little bit, but what I was doing was bending out the outside of the rail, and I didn't want to do that, so I figured it's been this way for over almost 30 years, and might as well just leave it like it is, and then weld the radiator like you see here. So it's not straight, but when the gas tank's on it, it sits right here, and the weight actually is held off of these two in the back, so it's not like this is going to make a huge difference. But you can see I routed the hydro lines up this side of the tractor and up to the front. I kept the T original like I mentioned, and we have one section of hose to go from here to the back of the selective control valve I haven't done yet. Put a new high pressure line here and there for the steering as well. I had it made at a local hydraulic hose shop. And the biggest change from the last video was I chose to go with the Vanguard 23 over that Predator engine. I found this one on eBay for a really affordable price. I didn't want to pass it up. And the difference between this model and the ones offered by some of the turnkey operations would be that, number one, this one came with a flange for the oil filter and a small radiator for the oil, which I won't be using this radiator. I'll have these lines go straight back to the rear radiator. This one does not have provisions for a front PTO, and obviously it has all the controls here on the front panel, as well as the local throttle control. So I'll just remote some of the electronics into the dash and run a throttle and choke cable and run it that way. I have it sitting up on 1-inch blocks right now, and that brings the front of this output shaft to almost the exact same height as the Onan P218 was. And I'll wait to get a PTO to set the front to back spacing, and then once that's all determined, I'll make up some mounts out of this 1-inch square tube. I already checked all the clearances and to the side panels and to the front here. The only thing I think I'm going to have to alter is maybe this section of the frame, because you can see the oil filter is right up against it. So what I might have to do is take a small notch like this out of the frame, and if it looks like it's going to be enough where I have to worry about the integrity of the frame, I'll probably double up like a bar down here and weld it, because I don't even have to use this hole for oil anymore. I can use the other side. So I could really box all this in to make provisions for that oil filter. I do like that spot for it, because if this was open, all you'd have to do is unscrew it, pop it off, pop a new one on, and screw it back in again. It's not like it's horizontal where you unscrew it and you make a mess. So I like that. Anyways, that's where we're at. Hopefully within the next week or so, I'll have most of the motor figured out, have it mounted, and come up with a drive shaft, which I have a couple ideas on how to get the PTO off the side of the engine. So making some slow but steady progress on this John Deere 318.